Ever feel caught between faith and science? Well, let's explore a totally different way to look at this.
So often, it feels like you absolutely have to pick a side. It's a real tug-of-war.
And that leaves you with two camps, right? One rejects science, the other rejects faith. But what if this whole conflict is just a trap? One scholar, Mustafa İslamoğlu, thinks so.
He actually proposes a third way, a path where both science and faith can totally coexist.
The core idea is this. Think of the Quran and nature as two books written by the same author.
So evolution isn't a belief, but Sunnatullah, one of God's observable laws in creation.
As he says, it's not something to believe in, but something you can actually know.
Okay, but what about scripture? The whole be and it is thing sounds pretty instant. Well, if you look at the original Arabic, it's actually a process. It means be and it starts becoming.
So what about other stories? You know, like woman being created from man's rib.
Turns out that whole rib story, it's not actually in the Quran. It's an import.
These are called Israeliat, basically stories from other cultures that got mixed in over time.
And this all fits with what science shows us, a really, really long history of hominid development.
Which brings us to this key distinction. Bashar, the biological body, versus Insan, the conscious human. And that jump from one to the other is described metaphorically as receiving the breath of spirit.
You can think of the spirit as the unique package that makes us truly human. So in this view, Adam isn't the first biological humanoid, but the first morally responsible one.
This idea has had a huge ripple effect in Turkey, sparking all sorts of new conversations.
It's even helped people, like this biology professor, find their way back to their faith.
So the big takeaway here is that the debate itself is designed to be a trap.
It forces you into this false choice. Either deny God's creation or deny God's method of creation. Which really makes you wonder, what's the real conflict we should be focused on?
Have you ever felt, kind of caught in the middle? On one side, you've got your faith, this deep personal thing you feel in your heart. And on the other, you've got modern science telling us all this stuff about the world. It almost always feels like this huge conflict where you have to choose a side. And that right there is the question that sits at the very heart of it all. It's framed as this trap, right? A battlefield that forces you to pick. Are you Team God or are you Team Darwin? It's presented like you absolutely cannot have both. But is that actually true?
And look, the stakes here are incredibly high. This isn't just some abstract debate for scholars to kick around. We're talking about young people feeling like they have to ditch their faith just to be seen as rational. It shuts down real, honest intellectual conversations. And worst of all, it paints science, this amazing tool for understanding God's creation, as the enemy.
Okay, so to untangle this whole mess, we have to go back to the beginning and ask a really basic question. Where did this fight even come from? Is this conflict really an essential part of faith? Or have we just been telling ourselves the wrong story for a long, long time?
So check this out. Scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu puts forward this really powerful idea. He argues that for Muslims, this entire science versus religion showdown, it's actually a borrowed battle. It's an imported conflict that doesn't really have roots inside the Islamic tradition at all. And this quote just cuts right to the heart of it. Historically, in the West, you had the church, which often held this monopoly on knowledge, and it fought tooth and nail against scientific discoveries that seemed to challenge its authority. Which leads to this huge question. Why would a faith like Islam, which never had that kind of centralized church, inherit a war that was never its own to begin with?
And this timeline, wow. Just take a second and let this sink in. We're talking about a full 1,000 years before Darwin ever published his book. You've got Muslim thinkers like Al-Jahiz in the 9th century writing about the struggle for existence. You have An-Nizam, Ibn Miskawayh, Ibn Khaldun, all of them exploring ideas about transformation, about the progression of species. This wasn't some taboo foreign idea. It was part of a rich, ongoing conversation.
So if the conflict is imported, what's the alternative? How do we build a new framework that feels more authentic? Well, İslamoğlu proposes this beautiful way of seeing creation based on what he calls God's two books. So here's the breakdown. Think of the book of nature, the universe, biology, physics, as the primary text. It is God's creation itself, showing us the what and the how. The Quran, then, is like the guidebook. It doesn't replace the main text, it points to it. It gives us the why and the who. It's the lens that helps us read the book of nature, not just with our eyes, but with a sense of meaning and purpose. And that's the absolute game changer. The purpose of Scripture isn't to be a biology textbook, it's a book of signs, or Ayat. It's like a finger pointing out at the wonder of the universe, encouraging us, heck, commanding us to go out and study the world, to read that primary text for ourselves.
All right, let's put this idea to the test. A very common argument you hear for instantaneous creation comes from this Quranic phrase, kun fayakun. It's almost always translated as be, and it is. Like a sudden magical command. Poof, something just appears out of nowhere in a flash.
But hold on, this is where a deep dive into the original Arabic grammar reveals something absolutely profound. The word fayakun isn't just a simple one-and-done command. The verb tense actually implies an ongoing process, a continuous present and future. So be and it is much more accurately understood as be and it enters a state of becoming. It's not a magic trick, it's the launch of an epic process. That tiny shift changes everything.
So, if creation itself is a process of becoming, then how does that change the way we approach the most sensitive, most difficult part of this whole debate? The story of human origins, the story of atoms.
The secret sauce here is this crucial distinction the Quran makes. It uses two different words. First, there's Bashar. Think of this as the biological creature, the physical, hominid form that we can study in fossils. But then there's Insan. This is the morally conscious human, the being infused with God's spirit, with intellect and free will. So one is the biological hardware, the other is the conscious software running on it.
And look how this timeline just clicks everything into place. You have the scientific record of hominid evolution, that's the long, slow development of the Bashar. And then, at a certain point in that journey, one of these beings is chosen, Adam, and is elevated, becoming the first Insan, the first human being gifted with moral responsibility. So in this view, Adam isn't the first biological creature, he's the first morally accountable one.
Okay, I know what you're probably thinking. But wait a minute, what about Eve? What about the whole story of her being created from Adam's rib? That's a huge part of the creation story for so many people.
So, to understand stories like that, scholars have this really important critical tool. It's called Israeliat. It's basically a category for all those narratives and stories that were absorbed into Islamic culture from older Judeo-Christian sources, but, and this is the most important part, are not actually found in the Quran itself. You can think of them as cultural imports, not scriptural truths.
So let's just run the rib story through a simple three-step filter. Ready? Step 1. Does it align with the Quran? Nope, not there. Step 2. Does it align with the book of nature, with biology? Definitely not. And step 3. Can we trace its origins back to a pre-Islamic source? Yes, we can. The story fails on every count, which shows us that it's an import, not an authentic part of the revelation.
So after all of this, where does that leave us? What's the big takeaway? Well, we've basically dismantled the false conflict, and in its place, we've found this powerful new paradigm that lets us move way beyond that impossible choice we started with.
And this new paradigm really centers on this beautiful concept called Sunnatullah, which means God's way or God's system. These are the unbreakable laws and processes, like gravity or the laws of physics, that God uses to govern the universe. And from this perspective, evolution is no longer some random, godless theory. It is the very method, the very system, the Sunnatullah, that God uses for creation itself. And this right here, this is the whole journey on one slide. We move from that old trap of creation versus evolution to this new paradigm of creation through evolution. We go from faith or science to faith and science. And we shift our image of God from, say, a simple potter just molding clay, to a divine lawgiver, the brilliant architect of the elegant processes that bring the entire universe into being. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory. It has a real profound impact on people's lives. The author of these ideas got a message from a biology professor who said that after reading this, he was able to reconnect with the God he had felt forced to say goodbye to years ago. I mean, that is the power of dismantling a false choice. And that leaves us with one last, really crucial question to think about. If we can accept that nature itself is a divine text, a book filled with God's signs just waiting to be understood, what do we really lose when we refuse to even open it and read?
So in the mid-19th century, when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, the religious establishment in London, they went absolutely ballistic.
Oh, totally. Which is the part of the story everyone knows, right?
Right, exactly. You probably know that part.
Mm-hmm.
But what you might not know is how they actually attacked him.
Yeah, the specific angle they took.
Because the church authorities and the conservative press back then, they didn't just call him a heretic or, an atheist. They accused him of something incredibly specific. They claimed that by promoting the idea that humans evolved from earlier primates, Charles Darwin had basically become a Muslim.
Which, to a modern listener, that sounds completely absurd.
It sounds like a joke.
Right, because we're so used to this contemporary narrative that positions conservative religious thought, especially in the Middle East, as just vehemently anti-evolution.
Yeah, like they're polar opposites.
Exactly. But those 19th century British clerics, they were actually well aware of something that much of the modern world has just completely forgotten.
Which is the crazy part.
It really is. The idea that biological life evolved over these vast stretches of time, progressing from simple organisms up through the animal kingdom and eventually to early hominids, well, that wasn't invented in Victorian England.
Not at all.
No, it had been written about, debated, and actually accepted by towering Islamic scholars and scientists nearly 1,000 years before Darwin was even born.
1,000 years. And that profound historical amnesia, that is the beating heart of today's deep dive. We're unpacking this truly staggering piece of source material today.
It really is a dense one.
Yeah, it's an in-depth, highly intellectual transcript of a conversation with the Turkish author and scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu. And they're discussing his book on creation, evolution, biology, and scriptural text.
And what makes this source material so compelling, I think, is that the author is stepping directly into a cultural minefield.
Oh, without a doubt.
He's looking at this supposedly endless, totally exhausted war between science and religion, specifically evolutionary biology versus divine creation. And he's arguing that the entire conflict is based on a massive, centuries-long cultural misunderstanding.
Right. And before we really get into the weeds here, I do want to set some ground rules for you listening. Because this source deals with highly charged religious, historical, and biological debates.
Very charged.
Very. So our goal today is not to endorse any specific theological or political viewpoint. We are not taking sides.
We're just the guides.
Exactly. We're just impartial guides, unpacking the author's arguments and insights exactly as they're presented in the source material, just so you can understand this really unique perspective.
And we're going to examine the architecture of his argument today. We'll look at how he deconstructs linguistic mistranslations that changed how people view time.
Which is fascinating.
It changes everything. We'll unpack the imported cultural folklore that contaminated early theology, and we'll look at the literal biological history hiding inside your own body right now.
The author is basically attempting to build a bridge between the rigorous findings of modern anthropology and a deeply rooted metaphysical spirituality. He argues that accepting science and protecting spirituality are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, the exact same pursuit.
So setting the stage here, the author's very first major claim just stops you in your tracks.
Yeah, it's a big one.
He argues that the concept of a war between science and religion is actually a uniquely Western import.
Like a historical trauma that got packaged up and shipped around the world.
Exactly. And to understand that trauma, you really have to look at the epistemic monopoly that was held by the church in Europe for centuries.
Right.
The church didn't just tell you how to pray or, how to achieve salvation. They literally told you how the physical universe was constructed.
They owned reality.
They did. They held these strict, inflexible dogmas about the age of the earth, the movement of the celestial bodies, what was at the center of the universe.
So when someone like Copernicus or Galileo looks through a telescope, it says, hey guys, the Earth actually revolves around the sun.
They aren't just presenting new data.
Yeah.
They're committing a capital offense against the institution that defines reality.
And the church's response was brutal.
Yeah.
They excommunicated the knowledge. They banned the books. They placed scientists under house arrest or, worse, burned them at the stake.
So science in the Western world literally had to go to war with religion just to survive.
It was a literal fight for its life.
Right. So the idea that to be scientific is to be anti-religious is just baked right into the DNA of the Western Enlightenment.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I had to pause when reading the author's take on how this applies to the Islamic world, because Islam doesn't have a Vatican.
No, it doesn't.
There's no pope. There is no centralized clerical hierarchy that gets to issue binding universal fatwas on what is or isn't biologically accurate.
And the author is quite blunt about this. He states that having an institutional church in that sense is completely antithetical to core Islamic theology.
So the obvious question is, if there is no institutional gatekeepers to feel threatened by a telescope or a dinosaur fossil, where did this intense modern anti-evolution stance in the Muslim world even come from?
Well, it's like downloading a massive software update that was coded for a completely different operating system.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. The update is meant to fix a bug in a centralized hierarchy, but you install it on an open source network and suddenly the whole system crashes.
Yeah.
The author asserts that this reactionary creationist movement was imported almost wholesale from American Puritan and Protestant movements in the 20th century.
Wait, really? From American Protestants?
Yeah, it was a reactionary defense mechanism. As Western imperialism and secularism expanded, conservative voices in the Middle East imported these American Protestant anti-evolution arguments.
So they translated them into Arabic and Turkish?
Exactly, thinking they were defending their faith against Western secularism. But the great irony, according to the author, is that they were actually adopting a Western Protestant anxiety.
And abandoning their own rich native scientific heritage in the process.
Precisely. And the source points out how unnatural this anti-science stance is by pointing directly to the foundational text itself.
Yeah, the author cites a specific verse from the Quran, Surah Al-Ankabut, verse 20, and it explicitly tells the reader to travel the earth and see how creation began.
It doesn't say, sit in a dark room and read a book to see how it began.
Right. It delegates the actual mechanics of creation to the physical observation of nature.
The scriptural text is essentially saying, I am a book of moral consciousness. I am not a geology textbook.
I'm not a manual on cellular biology.
Exactly. If you want to know how the mountains were formed, go look at the tectonic plates. If you want to know how biological life diversified, go dig in the earth.
So the author notes that claiming your religion requires you to reject scientific discovery is just a profound contradiction. You are rejecting the very instructions of the religious text you claim to be defending.
But, if the text actively directs people to look at the physical earth, to understand the mechanics of creation, how did we end up with this pervasive cultural idea that God just snapped his fingers and everything popped into existence instantly?
Right. How did the universe become a magic trick?
What's fascinating here is that the source material dives into what might be one of the most consequential linguistic misunderstandings in human history.
It's amazing how much weight a single word can carry.
It really is. It revolves around how ancient languages are translated and how these subtle grammatical shifts can fundamentally alter an entire civilization's cosmology.
Let's talk about the phrase kun fayakun, because in English it's almost always translated as be, and it is.
Right.
If you grow up anywhere near these Abrahamic traditions, you hear some version of this. God says, let there be, and boom, it exists.
It sounds like instantaneous creation.
Exactly. Poof, there's a mountain. Poof, there's a fruit fly. Poof, there's a human. No time elapses, no process occurs, just instant materialization.
But the author pulls out the Arabic grammar and demonstrates that this translation is fundamentally flawed.
How so?
Well, kun fayakun is almost universally treated as a past tense event in popular culture, as if God said be and it immediately was. But the word yakun in Arabic is actually a mudari verb.
Okay, I really want to anchor this for anyone listening who isn't an Arabic linguist. A mudari verb isn't past tense, right?
No, not at all.
It's much closer to the English continuous ing form. It's a verb that captures the present, the ongoing continuous action, and the future, all rolled into one.
It implies a state of unfolding. So a literal, grammatically accurate translation of kun fayakun is not the magic wand of he said be and it was.
Right.
The true meaning is he says be and it enters a process of becoming.
It enters a process of becoming. I mean, that completely shatters the magic wand narrative.
Totally.
It means creation isn't an event that ended, it's an ongoing operation.
It shifts the entire paradigm. Creation becomes synonymous with natural law. And the author links this linguistic reality directly to the biological reality of the natural world.
Because you can't just say be and instantly get a complex organism.
Right. An amoeba, a blue whale, a human being, these require a process. And that biological process of becoming over vast stretches of time is quite literally the definition of evolution.
And the source material uses our own bodies as the ultimate proof of this. The author talks about this genetic ledger we all carry.
It's incredible to think about.
Every single living thing today carries a biological signature that stretches back 4 billion years to the very first single-celled organisms.
The mechanics of this are just breathtaking when you slow down to think about them. If you look at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down almost exclusively from the mother,
And the Y chromosome passed down from the father.
you are looking at an unbroken chain of biological inheritance.
Right. Your mother got her mitochondrial DNA from her mother, who got it from hers, stretching back through early humans, back through early hominids, back through ancient mammals, all the way back to the primordial oceans.
It's an unbroken line.
Every single ancestor in your specific lineage had to survive long enough to reproduce, signing that genetic ledger, passing it down to the next link in the chain.
And this 4 billion year story isn't just a human story. The earthworm has its ledger. The sea cucumber has its ledger.
We all have the receipts.
Exactly. The author argues that this vast, unimaginably complex genetic process is the way the creator chose to create.
To demand that God bypass this incredible system, this elegant, mathematically precise process of becoming, and instead just poof things into existence out of nothing, is frankly a bizarre form of human arrogance.
It really is. It's essentially telling the architect of the universe, I don't like the 4 billion year process of DNA you designed. I'd prefer a cheap parlor trick.
Right. But if the universe is running on a 4 billion year unbroken chain of natural law and genetic processes, it forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question about God and theology.
Yeah, it brings up the big one.
How do miracles fit into a universe that refuses to break its own rules? Does a God of natural process still suspend gravity to pull a rabbit out of a hat?
The author tackles this head-on, actually, and his historical findings regarding the concept of the miracle are incredibly disruptive to traditional dogma.
This was the moment in the source material where I actually had to go back and reread the paragraph twice.
Oh, I did the same thing.
The author points out that the Arabic word for miracle, which is mu'jiza, does not appear anywhere in the Quran. Not a single time.
Nowhere.
Furthermore, it doesn't appear in the most foundational, authentic collections of sayings from the Prophet Muhammad, like the Kutub al-Sittah. It simply isn't there.
It is a concept that was injected into the theology centuries later.
Which is wild.
And to understand why that absence is so critical, we have to examine the etymology of the word mu'jiza. It derives from a root that means to incapacitate, to leave helpless, or to corner someone.
Okay, tada.
Yeah, now apply that definition to the concept of faith. If a divine being uses unnatural magic tricks like suspending the laws of physics, making mountains float, or turning solid rock into water instantly to corner a human being into believing, what happens to the concept of human choice?
It completely evaporates.
Exactly.
If someone turns off gravity in front of me, I am no longer making a moral or intellectual choice to believe in them. I'm being bullied by a violation of physics into total submission. I am left helpless.
And that is the crux of the author's philosophical argument against the traditional concept of miracles. He argues that for faith to have any moral value whatsoever, the human being must possess the absolute freedom to believe or to deny.
Right.
If the universe were filled with physics-breaking magic tricks designed to force submission, the whole system of free will would just collapse. A religion based on free choice cannot logically rely on mu'jiza.
Wait, I need to stop you there. Because if the scripture doesn't use the word for miracle anywhere, then what word are billions of people reading when they encounter these stories of divine intervention?
The word the text actually uses is ayat, which translates simply to sign.
A sign, an indicator, not a magic trick that breaks reality.
Exactly. And the text explicitly lists what these signs are. The sun is an ayat, the orbit of the moon, the germination of a seed in the soil, the water cycle, the complex anatomy of animals and human beings. These are all ayat.
The plural of ayah.
Right. The argument here is that the entirely natural, law-abiding, mathematically precise functioning of the universe is the sign. You don't need the laws of physics to break to see the divine. You need to observe how flawlessly the laws of physics operate.
It's like the natural world, biology, geology, physics is the main textbook.
Yeah.
It's vast, it's complex, and it's full of raw data.
I love that analogy.
And the scriptural text is merely the study guide. The study guide doesn't contain all the data. It just points its finger at the main textbook and says, hey, pay close attention to the chapter on embryonic development. It's really important.
Yes, exactly.
The author is arguing that if you deny the natural laws, if you deny evolution or the age of the earth, you are essentially ripping pages out of the main textbook while claiming to revere the study guide.
The scripture's purpose is to grant consciousness, to explain why you should look at the universe. Science is the rigorous tool used to figure out what you are actually looking at. They work in tandem.
But if they work in tandem, and if the scriptural text was always meant to guide people toward observing the natural world, we have to address how the religious tradition became so deeply clogged with unscientific mythological stories.
We do.
Specifically, the story that the first woman was created from a man's rib.
This is a vital part of the author's deconstruction. To understand how theology becomes contaminated over time, the author introduces a concept known as Israeliat.
Right, and just for context, the author actually titled the book they're discussing was Woman Created from a Man's Rib. That's the grounding question for this entire exploration.
And Israeliat is the key to answering it. This term refers to the ancient Near Eastern folklore, Judeo-Christian mythological traditions, and cultural legends that slowly seeped into Islamic commentary and exegesis over the centuries.
How did that happen?
Well, you have to picture the historical context. Early Muslims were living alongside established Jewish and Christian communities who had centuries of their own rich, deeply ingrained storytelling traditions.
Right, they were all mingling.
Exactly. So when early Quranic commentators encountered narrative gaps in a scriptural story, they often subconsciously filled those gaps using the cultural folklore floating around in the ether of the Middle East.
It's essentially ancient theological fan fiction that over hundreds of years gets treated as canon.
That is a very accurate way to frame it. The author argues that by cross-referencing these later Islamic commentaries with much older texts like the Talmud, the Mishnah, or ancient Sumerian myths, scholars can easily spot these imported storylines.
Because they stand out.
Yeah, they stick out because they contradict the foundational logic of the Quran itself.
And the most glaring example of this contamination is the rib story. The narrative that Eve was created from Adam's 13th crooked or unlucky rib.
Right.
The source emphatically states that this is a classic piece of Israeliat. It is imported folklore that fundamentally contradicts the biological reality of a universe operating on a process of becoming.
You don't get a fully formed human female instantly magicked out of a male rib bone.
No. Plus, anatomically speaking, human males do not have a missing or uneven number of ribs. The biology disproves it instantly.
But the author isn't just debunking this to win an argument about anatomy. He highlights the devastating real-world consequences of this specific myth. This is where theology bleeds into sociology.
Because ideas have consequences. So what does this all mean for us today? If you spend a whole book debunking a rib myth, it's not just an academic exercise.
Not at all.
The author passionately argues that this specific piece of Israeliat established women, theologically, as secondary beings. If man is the primary original creation and woman is merely a derivative byproduct made from a crooked appendage, you have fundamentally degraded her ontological status.
You have baked misogyny into the origin code of humanity.
Wow.
And the author traces a direct, undeniable line from this imported theological degradation to horrific societal outcomes. He argues that this mindset is the foundational justification for gender-based violence.
It gives it a divine excuse.
Exactly. It is the psychological root that justifies depriving women of their inheritance, treating them as lesser citizens, and silencing their voices in the public square.
He even connects it to the horrifying tragedy of women being abused, divorced, or murdered simply for giving birth to girls instead of boys.
Which is a compounding tragedy.
It really is, because modern biology tells us it's the male's chromosome, the sperm, that actually determines the sex of the child anyway.
Which is why the author believes that clearing away these imported myths is a moral imperative. It is about restoring the dignity of the human being by aligning theology back with the observable reality of the main textbook.
So let's clear the board. If human beings didn't pop into existence via an instantaneous magic trick, and women weren't magicked out of a hijacked rib bone, how exactly does this perspective define the origin of humanity?
Yeah, let's get into the timeline.
How do you square the cold, hard fossil record with the scriptural narrative of a chosen human?
This is where the author's synthesis of anthropology and theology becomes truly elegant. He introduces a vital conceptual distinction found in the linguistic roots of the text. The profound difference between Besher and Insan.
Let's clearly define those two terms because they are the hinge upon which this whole theory rests.
Okay, so Besher refers to the biological entity, the physical hominid, the creature of flesh, bone, and instinct that walked the earth. Insan, on the other hand, refers to the fully conscious, morally accountable human being. The author argues that biological evolution, the 4 billion-year process of natural selection, perfectly explains the development of the Bashar.
And the source material gets incredibly specific about this biological timeline. The author actually walks the reader through his own experience at the Smithsonian, standing face-to-face with the remains of Lucy.
Oh, yeah, Lucy is the famous Australopithecus afarensis fossil discovered in Ethiopia, dates back approximately 3.2 million years.
The physical details he provides are just so grounding. He points out that Lucy was tiny, standing under 1 meter tall. Her brain capacity was only about 360 cubic centimeters.
Right, which is small.
Very. To put that in perspective for you listening, your modern human brain is roughly 1,300 to 1,400 cubic centimeters. So she was undeniably a biological hominid, a Bashar, but she was profoundly different from us.
He notes specific anatomical realities about her skeleton, too. By examining the foramen magnum,
Which is the hole at the base of the skull where the spinal cord enters.
exactly, anthropologists know she could stand upright. But she couldn't lift her head fully because she lacked certain cross ligaments in the neck.
How interesting.
Furthermore, she possessed absolutely no biological apparatus for speech. The jaw structure, the specific muscles required for complex vocalization, the hyoid bone placement, these were entirely absent.
She was at the very beginning of the hominid timeline. And the source traces this slow, agonizing progression from Homo habilis, the toolmakers, to Homo erectus, who started walking fully upright around 2 million years ago.
Then to Homo naledi, and finally steering toward Homo sapiens.
And during this progression, the author highlights a fascinating evolutionary trade-off, the profound biological cost of bipedalism, of walking upright.
The obstetrical dilemma. This is one of the most brilliant explanations of why humans are the way we are.
Okay, explain this, because I found this mind-blowing.
Okay, so when our ancient hominid ancestors evolved to walk consistently on 2 legs, the architecture of the pelvis had to change dramatically.
Right, because of gravity.
Exactly. It had to become narrower and bowl-shaped to support the weight of the upright torso and all the internal organs. But simultaneously, over hundreds of thousands of years, hominid brain sizes were rapidly expanding.
So you have a mechanical crisis.
A huge one. You have a larger skull trying to fit through a narrower birth canal. The biological solution to this dilemma was that human babies had to be born prematurely compared to almost every other mammal.
Think about the animal kingdom. A foal or a calf drops out of its mother, and within minutes it is standing up, finding milk, and walking around. Its brain and body are largely fully baked.
Right.
But a human infant is completely, desperately helpless. It cannot hold its own head up. It cannot move toward food. It cannot defend itself.
It requires over a year of intense, constant external gestation because its massive brain has to finish developing outside the womb.
If it stayed inside the mother any longer, it physically wouldn't survive the birth process.
And the author views this extreme biological vulnerability not as a design flaw, but as a profound ayah, a sign.
How so?
Because that helplessness necessitates extended parental care. Extended care necessitates a fiercely loyal tribal community to protect the vulnerable mother and child.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that community fosters deep social bonds, which in turn require complex communication, language, and empathy. The mechanical restriction of the pelvis literally forced the hominid to become a deeply social creature.
That is incredible. So biology elegantly explains the Bashar. It explains the upright hominid with a large brain and the complex social structure. But at what point does this biological hominid become the insan?
The human.
Right. When does it transition from a highly intelligent primate to the morally accountable human being mentioned in Scripture? Because a big brain and a tribal structure aren't exactly the same thing as a soul.
This brings us to the scriptural concept of the breathing of the Spirit. The text often uses the phrase, "We breathed our spirit into him."
And the author is very careful to clarify that this is entirely metaphorical, right?
Oh, absolutely. God does not have lungs. He's not administering divine CPR to a clean statue.
Right.
The spirit, in this philosophical context, represents a specific package of emergent traits. It marks the sudden, revolutionary arrival of intellect, free will, deep consciousness, and most importantly, conscience meaning morality.
It's the cognitive leap to Homo sapiens sapiens, the creature that knows it knows.
The author makes a sharp distinction here. Animals possess intelligence. They have instinct, they can problem solve, they can even show rudimentary empathy.
Sure.
But they do not possess a moral framework, and they do not experience time the way we do.
What do you mean by that?
Well, A dog does not sit by the window regretting a mistake it made 3 years ago and promising to be a better dog next decade.
Right.
An animal experiences life largely in a continuous singular present tense.
But a human being, the Insan, is defined by self-awareness.
Yeah.
We can look in a mirror and ask the most terrifying and profound philosophical question. Who am I, and what is my purpose? That capacity for abstract self-reflection, for understanding the deep past and predicting the distant future, and for making choices based on a moral conscience rather than pure instinct. That is the spirit breathed into the biological Besher.
That is the moment the hominid becomes human.
It perfectly layers the metaphysical onto the physical timeline. But it leads to a massive historical question.
Which is?
Once humans achieved this incredible level of consciousness, how did they organize themselves? And crucially for the theological narrative, where does the specific figure of Adam fit into a 3.2 million year evolutionary timeline?
Right, because if Adam isn't the biological first human with no parents standing alone in a magical garden, then who is he?
This is perhaps one of the most provocative theories in the entire text.
I agree. The author posits that Adam represents an era. He represents a massive sociological shift in human development, and specifically, he is the chosen human who represents the dawn of organized moral accountability.
To understand this, we really have to look at the anthropology of the agricultural revolution.
Which changed everything.
Everything. The force points out that for about 2.5 million years, early humans and hominids were hunter-gatherers. They were nomadic foragers. They lived in small bands, ate what they found, and moved on.
Right.
Now, was there interpersonal violence? Of course. Animals have violence. Two hominids fighting over a piece of fruit is violence. But there was no organized war.
And that is a crucial sociological distinction. Violence is an individual, often instinctual act. War is a highly organized, heavily resourced societal enterprise.
Exactly.
The author notes that the first archaeological evidence of actual organized warfare mass graves with weapons dates back only about 13,000 years, found in the Nile Valley.
Only 13,000 years.
Yeah. For millions of years prior, hominids simply didn't have the societal structures necessary to wage war.
So what changed 13,000 years ago? Carbs?
Precisely. The discovery of agriculture.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this domino effect, because it explains the birth of modern society.
Let's do it.
For millions of years, humans spent 90% of their daily energy just trying to find enough calories to survive. But then, they discover how to plant complex carbohydrates, wheat, barley, rice.
Right.
Suddenly, for the first time in planetary history, they have an energy surplus. This massive caloric surplus rapidly feeds the evolving brain. But farming comes with a massive catch. You can't wander anymore. You have to stay next to your crops.
And this geographical anchoring triggers a huge sociological chain reaction. Agriculture leads to a surplus of food stored in granaries.
Okay, full abdominal.
A surplus of food introduces the concept of private property.
Right.
Suddenly, this silo of grain is mine and it is not yours.
Right.
If you have private property, you need to draw borders to define what you own. To protect those borders from starving nomadic tribes, you need guards.
And guards become armies.
Exactly. Because some people own the fertile land and others just work it, you get stark social classes, bosses and laborers. This stratification leads to the formation of states. And states, equipped with armies, borders, and resource hoarding, inevitably lead to organized war.
It is a direct, causal straight line from planting a wheat seed to building an army.
It really is. And as the author explains, with life suddenly threatening to become hell on earth due to this new devastating capacity for organized warfare and stark class divides, humans desperately needed a system.
Because pure instinct wasn't enough to govern a city-state.
No, they needed an overarching moral framework to prevent self-annihilation.
And this is the exact moment Adam enters the picture.
The author suggests that Adam represents the introduction of basic divine law and prophethood to a species that was suddenly capable of destroying itself on a massive scale.
He brought the ground rules.
Adam brought foundational moral laws, things like prohibitions against incest or rules against eating animals alive, basic grounding moral architecture for a society trying to survive its own newfound complexity.
The text uses this incredibly beautiful metaphor for the maturation of humanity through the lineage of the prophets.
I love this part.
It says Adam was the morning of humanity. It was just the dawn of our moral consciousness. We needed basic rules. Noah was the late morning. Abraham was the noon. Moses was the afternoon. And Muhammad was the evening.
It's a metaphor of intellectual and spiritual evolution. The author argues that by the evening of this prophetic cycle, humanity's collective intellect had matured.
We didn't need the hand-holding anymore.
Exactly. We no longer needed specific, miracle-wielding individuals to guide us step by step. Instead, we were given universal principles, a book of consciousness, and told to use our own mature reason, our own Insan, to navigate the future.
It's like humanity finally grew up. We moved out of the house. We don't need a chaperone constantly watching over us anymore. We just need a solid moral compass. It's a deeply empowering view of human capability.
It really is.
But if all of this science, the anthropology, the caloric math of the agricultural revolution, if it all perfectly aligns with a deep, nuanced reading of Scripture, why is there such a fierce, almost violent reaction against the word evolution among many religious conservatives today?
Yeah, why the outrage?
If it fits so elegantly, why are people so angry about it?
Well, the author argues that the outrage stems from a dangerous conflation of three very different concepts: the law of evolution, the theory of evolution, and social Darwinism. When people don't untangle these three things, panic ensues.
So let's untangle them. First, there is the law of evolution. This is the undeniable biological reality that species change over time, adapting to their environments. We can observe this in the fossil record and in genetics.
Right.
Then there's the theory of evolution. This refers to Charles Darwin's specific scientific explanations for how those changes happen, specifically natural selection. Theories are constantly updated and refined as we get better microscopes and better data.
And then there is the third concept, the dark side of the coin: social Darwinism.
The dangerous one.
Very. The author heavily separates biological evolution from social Darwinism. Social Darwinism was a twisted, ideological weaponization of Darwin's biological work. And it is vital to note that Darwin himself did not support this sociological application.
No, not at all.
Social Darwinism took the biological concept of survival of the fittest and violently applied it to human societies. It argued that the strong should dominate the weak, and that charity, empathy, or supporting the vulnerable was somehow unnatural and holding the species back.
It's a horrific philosophy, and the author traces exactly where it leads. Eugenics.
Right.
The idea of purifying the human race by forcibly sterilizing or discarding anyone deemed weak, disabled, or genetically defective.
It is the brutal philosophy of ancient Sparta reborn as modern pseudoscience. And as the source notes, it eventually became the horrifying justification for the atrocities of Nazi Germany, providing the philosophical bedrock for people like Joseph Mengele.
Social Darwinism strips away the empathy, the conscience, the very spirit that makes us insane. It tries to drag humanity back down to the level of the Becher.
Exactly. So religious conservatives look at the historical horrors of social Darwinism and eugenics, and they throw the baby out with the bathwater.
They reject the biological reality of evolution entirely because they are terrified of the ideological weaponization of it.
But in doing so, they fall right back into that profound historical amnesia we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive. They forget their own history.
Let's go back to those Islamic scholars, because the author provides the receipts to show that integrating evolutionary thought with theology isn't some modern compromise. It is the ancient tradition.
He pulls from the Islamic Golden Age. Over 1,200 years ago, a scholar named Al-Nizam from Basra was writing openly about the evolution of species, discussing how animals adapt to their environments over time.
1,200 years ago.
Yeah. He was followed by towering intellectual figures like Ibn Miskawayh, the great mystic Ibn Arabi, the poet Rumi, and the pioneering sociologist Ibn Khaldun.
Ibn Khaldun is the one that really blew my mind. The source explicitly notes what Ibn Khaldun wrote in his famous masterwork, the Muqaddimah, centuries before Darwin.
Ibn Khaldun wrote about the continuum of existence. He explicitly described how the realm of minerals progresses into the realm of plants, and the highest stage of plants progresses into the lowest stage of animals.
And it goes further.
It does. He wrote, verbatim, that the realm of apes and monkeys expands and progresses into the realm of human beings, characterized by reflection and thought.
He literally mapped out the evolutionary tree centuries ago.
Yep.
These scholars integrated evolutionary thought seamlessly into their worldview. They saw absolutely no contradiction between a divine creator and the slow, natural process of biological development.
The author is deeply frustrated by this modern amnesia. He argues that the modern religious rejection of evolution isn't defending traditional faith at all. It is abandoning a rich, scientifically advanced heritage out of modern ignorance.
So if the history is clear, and if the theology can align with the science without breaking, the author poses a final challenge.
Right.
He asks the reader to look for the ultimate, undeniable physical proof that we are walking products of this long divine process. And you don't need to look in ancient texts or fossil beds to find it. You just need to look at your own body.
The anatomical receipts. The text lists these fascinating evolutionary leftovers, vestigial treats that we all carry around every single day. Physical evidence of deep time trapped in our flesh.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's start with hiccups. We've all had them. They're annoying.
So annoying.
But the source points out that hiccups are actually a neurological leftover from our distant ancestors' evolutionary transition from gill breathing to lung breathing.
It's a fascinating neurological quirk. The phrenic nerve, which controls our diaphragm, is routed in a very strange, convoluted way down from our neck.
Which doesn't make sense for us.
No,
Yeah.
but it's an anatomical echo of our ancient aquatic past, similar to the nerve pathways in fish and amphibians. When a tadpole breathes through its gills, it uses a motor pattern that closes the glottis and contracts the breathing muscles.
So a hiccup in a modern human is essentially that exact same ancient reflex misfiring.
Exactly. Your body is remembering when it lived in the water.
That is insane. Then there are the smaller physical traits. The author mentions Darwin's tubercle, those small cartilaginous bumps some people have on the upper outer edge of their ears.
Yeah, I have those.
It's a remnant of a joint that allowed our primate ancestors to swivel their ears like radar dishes to catch sounds in the forest. We don't need to do that anymore, but the anatomical echo is still there.
And it extends across the animal kingdom, too. The author points to whale anatomy. If you take an X-ray of a whale's flipper, you do not just see a solid paddle of bone designed for swimming.
What do you see?
You clearly see the distinct bone structure of 5 fingers, with a wrist, a radius, and an ulna trapped inside the fin.
What?
Why? Because whales evolved from land-dwelling mammals that walked on 4 legs before returning to the ocean millions of years ago. The physical ledger of their journey is trapped in their skeleton.
The most undeniable everyday proof the author offers, the one that happens right in front of our eyes, is the flu virus.
This is a brilliant distillation of macro-level natural selection.
The author says, look at the flu virus. Every year, you have to get a new flu shot. Why? Because as the virus travels from person to person, from city to city, the RNA makes replication errors. It mutates.
Right.
The versions of the virus that can bypass our current antibodies survive and multiply, while the old versions die out. That changing of genetic code to survive a hostile environment is literally evolution happening in real time, right in front of our microscopes.
The author argues that if you believe in the flu, if you understand why you need an updated vaccine, you already believe in evolution, you are watching natural selection at work.
And this brings us to the ultimate purpose of the author's work: breaking the false trap. The author passionately warns against the psychological devastation caused by forcing people into a binary choice.
It's a huge problem.
When you tell a student, you must either deny rigorous, observable science to keep your faith, or you must abandon your spiritual worldview to accept reality, you are setting a destructive trap.
It breaks people. The text shares deeply personal anecdotes about the real-world impact of shattering this trap. The author talks about receiving letters from an atheist father and his son, and from biology professors who returned to a sense of spiritual faith after reading this book.
They return because they suddenly realize they didn't have to amputate their intellect to save their soul. They didn't have to choose between the observable reality of the laboratory and the profound meaning of the sanctuary.
To demand that the universe operate like a magic show, rather than marveling at the brilliant 4-billion-year genetic coding process that actually built us, is the ultimate human arrogance.
It's dictating terms to reality.
Exactly. It's saying, I refuse to be amazed by the slow, grinding miracle of DNA. I only accept instantaneous fireworks.
It is a profound shift in perspective. It allows you to look at the vast, terrifying expanse of evolutionary time, not as a threat to your existence, but as the intricate, awe-inspiring mechanism of your own creation. You are a walking, breathing library of deep time.
And understanding that library isn't a rejection of meaning, it is the deepest possible engagement with it.
Right. Whenever you look at a human baby taking a full year just to learn how to stand upright, struggling against the obstetrical dilemma, or whenever you feel a sudden, annoying hiccup in your chest, you are experiencing the grand 4-billion-year narrative of your own existence.
It's a physical reality that, if you let it, can deepen your philosophical worldview infinitely.
We've covered immense ground today. We've seen how a simple grammatical misunderstanding of a Mudari verb turned a beautiful process of becoming into a magic trick.
We've traced the hominid Becher gaining the moral weight of the Insan.
And we've reclaimed a history where science and spirituality weren't enemies, but partners.
It's been an incredible journey.
But before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thread to pull on, something for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Oh, I like this.
The source outlined how human intellect matured in stages, from the morning of Adam needing basic moral guardrails to the evening of universal principles, where humanity relies on its own mature reason. So, here is the provocative thought.
For 4 billion years, the blind, grinding laws of natural selection and biological evolution shaped us. The environment dictated our form.
But as we stand right now on the brink of artificial intelligence and advanced genetic engineering with tools like CRISPR allowing us to literally edit the DNA ledger, we are gaining the tools to direct our own evolution.
We are potentially on the cusp of the next great leap in development.
So are we entering a nighttime of human consciousness where our technological tools vastly outpace our moral framework? Or are we on the verge of a completely new morning?
What will the next phase of human morality look like when we are no longer just the products of evolution, but the ones holding the steering wheel?
It's something to think about the next time you get the hiccups.
Welcome to The Critique. Today we are examining a piece that boldly synthesizes Islamic theology and evolutionary biology, arguing that evolution is essentially the divine method of creation. But we need to get right into the feedback, starting with the linguistic reinterpretation of the Arabic phrase kun fayakun.
This linguistic reinterpretation of the phrase offers a profound paradigm shift but lacks anticipatory engagement with deep-rooted theological resistance. I mean, the pivot from grammar to biology is conceptually thrilling, but it actually leaves the author's intellectual flank entirely exposed.
Right, because the text heavily relies on the verb structure, the Mudzaari tense, to imply this continuous past, present, and future process. Like the author is asking us to view divine creation not as a sudden magic trick, but as planting a genetic seed that unfurls over billions of years.
Exactly. They point to the complexity of amoebas and fruit flies as proof. But the weakness here is that the text just doesn't explore why centuries of classical scholars interpreted this phrase as an instantaneous creation in the first place.
Yeah, it completely ignores the historical context.
It really does. And by ignoring that philosophical context of the orthodox view, it leaves the deeply knowledgeable reader highly skeptical. Like, you can't just assume a massive linguistic misinterpretation occurred in a vacuum for a millennium.
No, totally. If you present this solely as some newly discovered grammatical correction, the reader is just going to wonder how countless historical theologians miss something so fundamental. It inadvertently paints them as linguistically deficient.
Right, instead of engaging with a rigorously defended paradigm they were actually operating within. So the suggestion to fix this is that the author must fortify this linguistic claim by explicitly diagnosing the philosophical motivations behind the traditional orthodox reading before bringing in the modern biological evidence.
Okay, so how do they actually execute that on the page without, completely derailing the pacing of the biological argument?
Well, as a concrete example, the author could write a really brief, targeted section explaining that classical scholars historically prioritized emphasizing absolute, unrestricted divine power above all else.
Oh, I see. So to a medieval theologian, the idea of a process implied a reliance on time.
Yes, exactly. Under those classical frameworks, reliance on time equated to dependence, or limitation, or weakness. Instantaneous creation wasn't just some grammatical preference. It was a philosophical necessity to protect the absolute sovereignty of the creator.
That makes so much sense. So once the author acknowledges that historical fear on the page, they can then reframe their own evolutionary argument to directly counter it.
Precisely. They could demonstrate that designing a self-sustaining evolutionary framework, one with billions of latent genetic signatures across eons, actually illustrates a far more complex and majestic omnipotence.
Wait, yeah, because it takes infinitely more foresight to write a self-executing algorithm that runs perfectly for 13.8 billion years than it does to just conjure something out of thin air.
That is exactly the rhetorical pivot the text needs. You respect the historical scholar's core intent to magnify divine power, but you show how biological gradualism magnifies it even further. It bridges that theological gap beautifully.
It really builds a robust, intellectually honest foundation before we even get to the amoebas. So, moving on to the next major area, The demarcation between the biological hominid and the conscious human relies on a sudden influx of morality, which creates a jarring structural disconnect within the core thesis.
It really does. And the weakness is so apparent when you look at the timeline.
Yeah, because the text meticulously tracks physical evolution, right? Like starting from the 3.2 million-year-old hominid Lucy, her 360 cc brain capacity, all the way through Homo erectus. It's charted bone by bone.
Right, the changing pelvis structures for bipedalism, all of that.
Exactly. But then, right at the agricultural revolution, humanity supposedly receives the soul, this package of consciousness and morality, just out of nowhere. It's inadvertently recreating a God of the Gap scenario.
It really abandons its own internal logic by making the physical evolution so beautifully gradual, but the cognitive awakening incredibly sudden. The text mirrors the exact kind of instantaneous, miraculous intervention it literally just critiqued regarding the kun feyakun concept.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's a huge contradiction. You have to operate under two totally different sets of rules. The body gets the elegance of natural selection, but consciousness gets a magic wand.
Exactly. So my suggestion here is that the author must smooth this narrative transition by grounding the emergence of consciousness and the soul package within the same gradual, observable framework used for the anatomical traits.
But how do they do that? I mean, charting the evolution of something invisible is a huge challenge. We have fossil records for craniums, but, well, we don't have fossils for a conscience.
No, we don't. But as an example of how to fix this, the author could tightly intertwine the physical surplus of energy gained from agricultural carbohydrates with the slow generation-by-generation development of abstract thought.
Oh, interesting. So the shift from nomadic hunting to farming provided excess caloric energy, which literally changed brain chemistry.
Exactly. It fueled the expansion of the prefrontal cortex. And think about agriculture. It inherently requires delayed gratification. You plant a seed now to eat months later.
Right, and that capacity for delayed gratification is basically the prerequisite for impulse control, which is the foundation of moral agency.
You nailed it. The biological hardware had to slowly develop the capacity to support the metaphysical software. And the author is actually already sitting on another great piece of evidence for this.
Oh, you mean the 40,000-year-old cave paintings they mentioned? The ones lacking human-on-human violence?
Yes. They should utilize that existing mention, not just as a footnote, but as an earlier incremental stepping stone of this breathing of the soul.
Like a proto-morality?
Exactly. A slow simmering of empathy that predates full agricultural settlement. By stringing together toolmaking, burial of the dead, nonviolent art, and agricultural surplus, the development of the conscience becomes just as deeply rooted in time as the physical body.
That seamlessly bridges the biological data with the atheology. Which brings us to our final major point today. The strict separation of biological evolution from social Darwinism successfully insulates the argument from human atrocities, but it leaves the inherent ruthlessness of natural selection theologically unexamined.
Yeah, this is a massive philosophical hurdle. The weakness here is that by quickly dismissing social Darwinism purely to protect the science from being associated with, eugenics and figures like Hitler, the material skips over a glaring issue.
Right, because if biological evolution is God's chosen law, the Sunnatullah, the material has to account for millions of years of suffering, starvation, and brutal survival of the fittest before humans even existed.
Exactly. If the divine design relies fundamentally on a system where the weak are routinely culled and predators tear apart prey, the invested reader is going to ask how this reflects a merciful creator. The text currently just leaves this tension completely unresolved.
It essentially asks us to marvel at the elegant engineering of a bird's wing while totally ignoring the violence required to forge it. It's the classic problem of theodicy applied to a macro-evolutionary timescale.
It leaves the theology completely vulnerable to the most common critique of evolutionary creationism. So the suggestion is that the author must address the theological problem of evolutionary suffering head-on, engaging directly with the friction between a perfect creator and a deeply violent developmental mechanism.
Okay, but how do they construct that argument without sounding callous to the pain of the natural world?
Well, for example, the author could dedicate a section to the theodicy of evolution,
proposing that the harsh crucible of natural selection was the necessary pressure cooker required to produce a species capable of genuine resilience and free will.
So basically arguing that a biologically stagnant, perfectly safe world produces fundamentally limited organisms.
Exactly. Without the intense friction of an unforgiving environment, the complex neurological hardware needed for moral agency could never have been organically forged. The suffering isn't arbitrary cruelty. It's the required structural scaffolding.
Oh, I see. And they might also contrast the amoral necessity of animal survival with the profound moral responsibility of being human. Like, a predator hunting isn't acting out of malice, it's just operating under amoral physics.
Yes, cruelty is a human concept. True morality, empathy, and mercy can only be exercised in a universe where physical vulnerability inherently exists.
Right. Because sharing food has no moral weight if starvation is biologically impossible. The evolutionary reality of pain is the canvas on which the human soul paints its morality.
That is a remarkably strong framework for the author to use. They could even frame mass extinction events not as divine mistakes, but as the violent clearing of ecological niches necessary for human development. It transforms a glaring vulnerability into a logically robust strength.
It really does. So let's briefly recap the core insights to help the author maximize their work. First, we discuss bolstering the linguistic reinterpretation of kun feyukun by diagnosing the historical theological fears of classical scholars regarding time and limitation.
Right. Framing the slow evolutionary process as an algorithmic display of omnipotence that far exceeds instantaneous creation. And second, harmonizing the pacing of the text.
Yes, ensuring that the gradual evolution of the human body is matched by an equally gradual evolution of consciousness, using the caloric surplus of agriculture and the proto-morality of cave paintings to bridge that gap.
And finally, directly tackling the theological implications of natural selection's harshness, providing a robust theodicy that frames physical vulnerability as the required pressure cooker to forge true moral agency.
Absolutely. We warmly invite the listener to revise their manuscript based on these structural and philosophical insights and submit it back to us for a future critique.
Welcome to the debate. So, what if the divine breathing of the soul into humanity wasn't, a mystical, instantaneous magic trick, but the direct biological result of early humans learning to farm and eat surplus carbohydrates?
Well, it is a provocative idea, to say the least. I mean, if you are hearing that premise for the first time, you are probably wondering how on earth a dietary shift in wheat could possibly equate to the spiritual pinnacle of human creation.
Exactly. And today, we are analyzing a paradigm that forces us to ask that exact question. We are diving into the material from Yaratalish Ve'erem, which translates to creation and evolution.
Right.
It is a text that posits nature itself is the primary scripture, and that evolutionary science is a literal mechanism of divine creation. So we are tackling a pretty massive central question here. Does redefining religious milestones like miracles or the breathing of the soul through the strict empirical lens of biology and anthropology successfully rescue faith from anti-science dogmatism?
Or does it risk collapsing theology entirely into material science?
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it is a high-stakes, tightrope walk. I will be arguing that while the biological evidence this text presents is perfectly sound, fully reducing metaphysical events to anthropological accidents.
Like the caloric surplus.
Exactly. Like equating the infusion of the soul to a dietary shift in carbs. Well, it strips the source material of its transcendent reality. We lose the theology. We are left only with the anthropology.
And I am taking the position that this synthesis provides a really robust framework. It argues for purifying traditional religious texts of imported myths and asserts that evolution is not a threat to the divine, but is in fact the very method of divine creation. Right, this framework attempts to resolve the false dichotomy between science and religion by showing they were never historically at odds in this tradition.
It's out that evolution denial is actually a relatively recent import from American Protestantism and Puritanism. It is not native to early Islamic thought.
Yeah, exactly.
but my core contention is that the material overreaches. It treats anthropological milestones as exact, one-to-one theological equivalents. Making theology a mere trailing indicator of brain development loses the metaphysical weight of divine intervention.
I hear that hesitation. But let us look at it from the text's own historical and linguistic lens. The author isn't reducing the theology to fit modern science. They are arguing we have fundamentally misunderstood the theology for centuries.
Okay.
Take the famous divine command of creation, kun fayakun.
The instantaneous command?
Right. Traditionally, it gets translated as the instantaneous be, and it is, like a magical poof. But the text performs a linguistic analysis of the original Arabic. It identifies the word yakun as a fi'l mudari,
Which is a continuous present and future tense verb, right?
Precisely. It doesn't mean poof, it exists. It literally translates to be, and it enters into a continuous process of becoming. I want to pause on that because it radically shifts the paradigm.
Yeah, it does.
We are moving from the idea of a creator instantly spawning a fully formed universe to an architect initiating a 14 billion year chain reaction. It posits that the original text inherently describes a process spanning deep time.
I don't disagree with the linguistics of the continuous verb. It is a compelling reading, but where I start to push back is how aggressively the text strips away the supernatural.
How so?
Well, the author claims that miracles, in the rule-breaking, physics-defying sense, simply do not exist in the original texts.
Because the concept of a rule-breaking miracle, a mujiza, is absent from the Kutub-i-Sittah. For context, those are the 6 foundational collections of the sayings and actions of the prophet.
Right, the primary sources.
Exactly. The text notes that the idea of a miracle as a violation of natural law was imported much later from other traditions. The true divine signs, the Ayat, are the natural laws themselves.
Okay, but
just to finish that thought, it means the 4 billion year continuous genetic signatures found in everything from a single-celled amoeba to human mitochondrial DNA. That is the actual miracle.
Right, but acknowledging that the flu virus mutates, or that mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mothers over billions of years, doesn't automatically mean all ancient scriptural theology must be read as a modern biology textbook?
Well, not a textbook, but
I mean, the author is essentially forcing ancient scripture to conform perfectly to 21st century empirical standards. If a creator establishes the laws of physics and biology, why must that creator be utterly bound by them to the point of never, ever suspending them?
Because according to the text, suspending them would contradict the very nature of the creator. And this isn't a modern retrofit.
Right.
The text shows us that evolutionary thought was championed by 9th century scholars like Al-Nizam in Basra over 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, he argued that living things emerged through an evolutionary process.
Exactly. And later figures like Ibn Khaldun explicitly wrote about the gradual transition from primates to humans. Rumi wrote poetry about the stages of biological evolution. So the text positions biological evolution as Sunnatullah, the undeniable factual habit of the divine.
But the text goes beyond just saying evolution is real. It argues that the biological record is the only valid theological record.
And it backs that up by pointing to our own bodies. The physical evidence of this divine habit is written right into our anatomy. The text cites evolutionary vestiges to prove this. Take the human hiccup.
Oh, right, the gill to lung transition.
Exactly. Most people don't know why we hiccup. The motor pathway for breathing originally evolved in ancient fish, controlling gills near the brainstem. But as evolution progressed to mammals and we developed a diaphragm lower in our chest, that nerve pathway had to become absurdly long.
It travels all the way down.
Yeah, from the brain down through the chest, which makes it prone to spasms. That spasm is the hiccup. It is a neurological remnant of our evolutionary past.
And the whale flipper is another one.
Yes, look at a whale's flipper. If you x-ray it, you don't find a solid paddle. You find the exact bone structure of 5 hidden fingers, inherited from a land-dwelling mammalian ancestor. The text argues that to deny evolution is to literally deny the creator's chosen observable method of designing life.
That is all biologically sound. But have you considered the philosophical cost of this total naturalization?
What do you mean?
I mean, by saying the biological record is the only valid theological record, the text forces a complete redefinition of what a human being fundamentally is.
Well, I actually think it clarifies what a human being is, and it does so rather elegantly. It separates the biological hominid, which the text calls the Besher, from the conscious, morally accountable human, the Insan.
Okay, let's dig into that exact distinction, because this is where the friction really heats up for me. Walk me through the text's timeline here.
Sure. The text lays out a clear evolutionary timeline mapped to the fossil record. It starts with fossils like Lucy, the 3.2 million-year-old Australopithecus found in Ethiopia. Now, Lucy was roughly a meter tall, with a brain capacity of about 360 cubic centimeters.
Which is just a fraction of our modern brains.
Right, a fraction of our 1300 cc brains. She walked upright, but anatomically she lacked the vocal cords, the jaw structure, and the crossed ligaments in the neck required for human speech and upright head posture.
So she was Besher.
Exactly. A hominid, an insani, just an animal acting on instinct.
And the soul wasn't present yet.
Right, the soul didn't exist in Lucy. From there, the text traces the lineage to Homo erectus 2 million years ago. Learning to walk fully upright forced massive biological trade-offs. The pelvis had to narrow for bipedal walking.
Which meant human infants had to be born essentially premature, right?
Yes, just to fit through the birth canal. That forced intense social bonding and communal care just to keep the infants alive. But still, they were just Besher. The soul, as defined by the text, is the complete package of consciousness, intellect, will, and conscience.
And that emerged much, much later in Homo sapiens.
Exactly.
And this is the exact mechanism where the text loses me. I understand the fossil record. It is the causal mechanism the text assigns to the emergence of this soul that I simply cannot accept.
Why? I mean, it follows a direct biological logic.
Because the text claims that this soul package, this pinnacle of human consciousness and moral accountability, directly coincided with the agricultural revolution. It argues that discovering agriculture provided surplus carbohydrates.
Which it did.
Right, but it claims that this surplus caloric energy is what caused the human-grained cerebral cortex to grow to its current state.
Which is a biological fact. An energy surplus is absolutely required to power a highly complex cerebral cortex. I mean, our brains consume about 20% of our body's energy. You simply cannot evolve that on a sparse foraging diet.
Yes, biologically, calories build brains, but the text does not stop at biology. It creates a sociological pipeline and calls it theology.
How so?
Well, it says this carbohydrate-induced brain growth led to surplus production. Surplus production led to the concept of property. Property led to the need for borders.
Right.
Borders required guards, which created social classes, states, standing armies, and eventually organized war, with the earliest archaeological evidence of war appearing in the Nile Valley about 13,000 years ago.
So the logic holds perfectly.
The sociological logic holds, but listen to the theological conclusion. The text argues that because society became this complex, and because we started slaughtering each other over land, we suddenly needed a moral system to prevent total self-annihilation.
Yeah.
So the divine breathing of the soul is reduced to a sociological trailing indicator of a dietary shift in carbs. Do you see why that is a problem?
Well, elaborate on the problem for me.
It flattens the spiritual profoundness of human origins into mere evolutionary utility. If you're listening to this, you are probably thinking the exact same thing I am. Doesn't reducing the human soul to a dietary shift in wheat entirely ruin the magic of religion?
I don't think so.
But the soul isn't a divine spark breathed into humanity from a higher realm anymore. According to this text, it is just a pragmatic survival tool invented because we started eating wheat and fighting over property lines. It makes theology a byproduct of agriculture.
I think you are treating the biological mechanism as if it is somehow devoid of the divine, which is the exact fallacy the text is trying to dismantle. Let me offer an analogy. Think of it like writing code.
Okay.
If a programmer writes a beautifully elegant, self-updating algorithm that generates a complex video game universe over time, adapting to inputs and evolving, We don't say that programmer is less involved than if they had painstakingly drawn every single pixel by hand.
But drawing a pixel by hand is a direct intervention.
Sure, but writing the algorithm requires vastly more intelligence. The text posits a framework called the two books. Nature is the primary book, written by the creator.
And scripture is the secondary book?
Exactly. And its sole purpose is to point back to the primary book. If we accept that, then God wrote the algorithm of evolution. A biological mechanism like carbohydrate-induced brain growth leading to complex societal structures and moral reasoning isn't a reduction of the divine.
It's the execution of it.
Right. It is the literal, physical manifestation of the divine will.
But why call it a soul? Why not just call it advanced cognition?
Because the brain requires that specific physical energy to develop the capacity to ask the question, who am I? The text notes that Homo sapiens are the only species that can ask that question. Why must God operate outside of biology in some ethereal, magical realm to be considered divine?
Well,
if the agricultural revolution is what gave us the physical hardware to understand morality, then the agricultural revolution is the divine mechanism for breathing the soul into humanity. It's a structured, observable process.
The algorithm analogy is clever, but here is my counter. When you map the metaphysical strictly onto the material like that, the metaphysical ceases to do any independent work. I mean, if the breath of God is quite literally just a metaphor for surplus caloric intake and property law, then theology is just a poetic overlay on top of anthropology.
It is bringing theology down to reality.
But if we accept that human morality evolved purely as a survival tool against our own violent instincts, that brings us to a massive ethical consequence of this framework. And honestly, this is where I believe the material actually excels. Its ethical critique of evolutionary theory.
You are talking about the text's separation of biological evolution from social Darwinism.
Exactly. The text makes a vital and highly sophisticated distinction that a lot of religious critiques of evolution fail to make. It acknowledges that biological evolution is a factual, undeniable process, but it fiercely critiques social Darwinism.
The ideology of eugenics.
Right, discarding the weak, the whole might makes right mentality.
Which is a profound misreading of Darwin.
Yeah, the text points out that Darwin himself was not a social Darwinist. It was later sociologists and politicians, culminating in historical extremes like the eugenics movements and figures like Hitler and Mengele, who hijacked the biological theory.
They weaponized it.
Exactly. They used it to remove morality from the human equation and justify culling humanity. The text rightfully defends the biological science of evolution, while completely dismantling the ethical horror show that was retroactively attached to it.
It proves that just because nature operates on survival of the fittest, it doesn't mean human morality should. And the text takes that ethical purification a step further. It turns that same critical scientific lens inward onto its own religious traditions.
Right, the critique of Israeliat.
Yes. It uses this empirical framework to critique what it calls Israeliat. Let's define that term for clarity.
It refers to imported folklore, right?
Exactly. Specifically, older Judeo-Christian myths and cultural fabrications that bled into Islamic theological commentary over the centuries. They aren't in the original text, but they got adopted by scholars and treated as divine truth.
Like the creation of Eve.
That is the prime example the text uses here. The rib myth. The text tackles the pervasive traditional narrative that Eve was created from Adam's 13th rib.
Which biology obviously refutes.
Right. By looking at the primary book Biology and Anatomy, we know this is factually absurd. Humans do not have an asymmetrical rib cage with a missing 13th bone in males. We have identical skeletal structures in that regard.
So the text argues this myth was imported.
Yes, from older cultural traditions and codified into religious commentary. But the author doesn't just debunk it for the sake of getting the anatomy right. They emphasize the dire, real-world consequences of clinging to these unscientific myths.
The sociological impact of bad science.
Exactly. Believing that women are biologically derivative, literally created from a crooked bone of a man, is not just a harmless fairy tale. The text argues this myth manifests directly in violence against women.
And the denial of inheritance rights.
Yes, and the systemic treatment of women as secondary, subordinate beings in various parts of the world. By enforcing the primacy of the book of nature, the text successfully uses science as a filter to excise harmful, fabricated traditions.
It purifies the faith of toxic folklore.
Exactly.
I absolutely concede the social utility of debunking the rib myth. It is an incredibly powerful example of using empirical reality to dismantle oppressive dogma. I mean, no one should be building gender hierarchies on bad anatomy.
Right.
But, and this is a massive but, I have to warn against the broader methodological danger the text is inviting by doing this.
What is the danger in fact-checking theology?
The danger is epistemological. If every traditional narrative, every piece of scripture that doesn't perfectly align with the primary book of nature is automatically discarded as a foreign myth, as Israeliat, then the religious tradition is hollowed out.
How so?
It risks becoming nothing more than a mirror reflecting whatever the current scientific consensus happens to hold at any given decade. But the scientific consensus is based on observable reality.
But science is inherently provisional. It updates, it shifts, it corrects itself.
Sure. If you anchor your entire theology to the exact anthropological findings of the year 2026, like the specific dating of the agricultural revolution or the exact cranial capacity of Homo erectus, what happens when anthropology updates its models in 50 years?
You just update the understanding.
But what if we discover a new hominid fossil tomorrow that completely rewrites the timeline of the cerebral cortex? Does God's truth have to be revised in the next issue of Nature magazine? If theology is just biology in a different font, it loses its ability to critique the material world from a higher, timeless vantage point.
But the text would counter that a theology divorced from material reality isn't a higher vantage point at all. It's just a delusion. And that brings us to the core synthesis of the material.
Right.
The material demonstrates that an intellectual faith in the modern world must integrate the reality of the fossil record. It must integrate the 4 billion-year unbroken chain of genetics and anatomical vestiges like the hiccup.
By redefining miracles not as magic tricks, but as the awe-inspiring natural laws themselves.
And the soul as cognitive evolution. Exactly. It purifies the tradition. It removes harmful myths like the rib narrative. It allows believers to look at a whale's hidden 5 fingers or a human fossil and see the deliberate, mathematically beautiful process of creation.
And I maintain that while embracing scientific reality is utterly non-negotiable, we cannot and should not deny the fossil record or the reality of genetics. Totally equating spiritual paradigms with biological timelines is a bridge too far.
You think it collapses the meaning?
I do. Reducing the advent of human morality and the divine soul to a byproduct of the agricultural revolution and caloric surplus leaves little room for the genuinely transcendent. It solves the historical conflict between science and religion by essentially letting the science consume the religion entirely.
Yet despite that tension, we both clearly agree that the material elevates the discourse.
Oh, undoubtedly. It effectively dismantles imported anti-science dogmatism.
And it shreds the cruelties of social Darwinism by separating the biological facts from the ethical atrocities.
Yeah, it forces a much more sophisticated conversation about what we actually mean when we talk about human origins. It demands that anyone engaging with theology today must also be scientifically literate, which is a massive necessary step forward.
Right, you cannot debate the soul if you don't understand the brain.
Exactly.
It brings to mind the programmer analogy we discussed. The tension between the elegant, self-executing code and the breathtaking virtual universe it generates.
Yeah.
Perhaps the most profound insight here is that the code and the universe aren't actually in opposition at all. The strict mechanics of the algorithm are exactly what allows the beauty to exist. The tension between material mechanisms and metaphysical meaning offers so much more to explore in the source material.
There is definitely a lot left to unpack.
We will leave it there for today. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.